As I record this, we are in the midst of a global health crisis. It's touching all of our lives. And though the event is giving rise to a lot of anxiety and fear, it also serves to remind us how connected and reliant we are on each other. Though I've never experienced anything like this in my lifetime, I think about other moments in my life that left me feeling sad, fearful, anxious, and even angry. During such times, I was tempted to allow those feelings to overwhelm me and convince me that there were more reasons to be fearful than to be hopeful. This collective fear and anxiety that we're feeling of what the future may bring in the coming days, weeks, and months can and does bring up the worst in some people. They believe in only the worst of outcomes, which helps them to justify their choices and their behavior. I choose to believe that, like many difficult and challenging moments in human history, we will move through and past this. It may not be free of pain, sorrow, and grief, but we can look forward to days that will again be filled with love, joy, and compassion. But rather than wait for that day, I want to see today as an opportunity to be grateful for what I do have and to reach out to people I love and am concerned about. To just check in and see that they're okay. It's important because when I'm feeling such fear and insecurity, I need to be reminded that I'm not alone in these feelings. And when I admit as much, I can be helpful to someone else. I never need to be alone during such dark times, and neither should you. As you'll hear in this episode with Ben Smith, who is the host and producer of A Small Voice Photography podcast, we share a lot in common beyond our love for photography and podcasting. We have shared experiences of fear, self-doubt, and insecurity. Yet each of us, in our own ways, have found a way to create things that we are proud of and have become invaluable to thousands of people all over the world, even though we may likely never know their names. As imperfect and as flawed as I am, I can still be a force for good in someone else's life today, and so can you. So pick up the phone and reach out to someone you care about, especially if you haven't talked to them in a while, and let them know that despite it all, you're thinking of them. Step away from the Twitter feed, the Facebook posts, and 24-hour news cycle, and just take time to say hello. They'll appreciate it, and most importantly, it will serve as a simple and powerful way to keep the light from being extinguished by the darkness. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. This is Ibadi on X, and welcome back to the Candid Frame. How long have you been doing the show now? 4 years or more?
4.5 years, yeah. I started it September 2015. So it'll be 5 years this September, so 4.5.
Well, congrats. You know,
well,
being able
to
last even that long is quite an accomplishment. I mean, being able to last more than a year in this game is a seminal point.
Well, I'm obviously, I'm very far behind you, but yes, I think it's partly about just having the kind of commitment to carry on regardless, really, as much as you can, which, I think is a pretty useful way to live in general and probably applies to all kinds of things, but it certainly applies to doing the podcast. Yeah. I think what probably happens is people very quickly realize how much work it is, and they weren't really bargaining on that. And they very quickly come to the conclusion that they just can't commit that amount of time, or they don't particularly have enough motivation to carry on. I suspect that's what happens in a lot of cases anyway.
Oh, yeah. I think I was just talking to someone else about blogging a couple of years ago. That was the big thing. And so a lot of people started blogs, thinking that they would garner them attention and would be a launching pad to something else. And they realized, oh, if I'm going to write a blog every 3 days or every day, that's a lot of work. And quickly figured out, and I think the reason you go into something is really a big factor in that. And if you go in for the wrong reasons, it's hard to maintain the momentum over weeks, months, and years, and to be able to do it consistently.
Yeah. It's really about kind of what are your expectations, going in. Like, clearly you'd have to be certifiably insane to get into podcasting on the grounds that there might be some income in it, for instance. So anyone who does that is going to be very quickly, disabused of their ideas. But I think if you go in with no expectation other than, you'll kind of get out of it whatever you put in, then that's probably the way to kind of approach it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things what's amazing about your story is how much alike we are.
Yeah, I know. It's
not
crazy.
Only considering that we both do the same type of podcast, but that our personal history is kind of like really analogous. And it was just like, wow, man, it's like a mirror, except with an accent.
It really, really is. I know, exactly. Apart from those obvious differences in terms of our, the culture, and the places that we grew up in and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's amazing. The episode that you did with Jamie on your own podcast, where you, for once, were actually the sort of subject rather than the interviewer. And I was just amazing how many little kind of checkboxes were ticking in my head as you talked, really, to the point where it was quite spooky. Like you talked about how you taught yourself to type when you were a kid, right? And I remember, and I think, I did exactly the same thing. And I was like, that's kind of a very particular thing, isn't it? Like that's kind of weird, really, in a way that we have these little strange things in common.
Yeah, I was listening to the episode where you were being interviewed, and I forget the young lady who was interviewing you.
Yeah, Abby Traylor Smith.
Okay, yeah, it was fascinating, like how you had that meltdown, I think, in high school.
Yeah.
Which was completely the same thing that happened to me. Now I kind of understand what was happening during that time. It was like I was suffering from depression and undiagnosed depression at that time. And because I wasn't talking to anybody, I just kind of, completely petered out in my senior year in high school. Just was completely lost for a couple of years after that.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really kind of interesting. We both found ourselves in through writing and the photography that seemed to have been, the life preserver that we both needed to be able to, move forward in life, even if it was sort of, with a lot of missteps and,
absolutely,
a lot of decisions that weren't ideal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some kind of correlation between, having kind of a creative personality and being sensitive in some way, and therefore, liable to have the kind of experiences we had. I mean, certainly, I had a lot of challenges with depression and self-esteem and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, certainly when I was young, it was just, I didn't even have, I can't even claim to have had any kind of a dramatic meltdown, really, which, would be a better story. It's much more mundane than that. It was kind of a long, continuous kind of low-level meltdown, really, my entire kind of formative experience. But yeah, and then I think you can seek comfort and solace in, creative pursuits. As you say, writing and photography quite often provide that.
Yeah, and I think what was really kind of interesting about both of our experiences, and I thought it would be really helpful for people to hear about it, is just the fact that even though you are going through those moments of, depression, whether it's clinical or not, and self-doubt, anxiety, insecurity, that we both managed to move forward in an area that we had a passion and an interest for. And I think so many people don't even get that far, because despite the fact that, we were struggling with that stuff, and we sometimes, or oftentimes have regretted our choices, we were nevertheless both sort of making progress in the areas in which we wanted to, right? Where other people don't even get that far. They allow the voices in their head and the feelings that they're having to completely stop them, and they just simply give up, and they take on something else that's safer and doesn't involve as much risk, or what they conceive as risk. And it was really interesting hearing your story, that how analogous that was to you and me, because I can certainly look back and think that, if I'd done this, if I could have done that, I could have gotten so much further. But, I think I too easily discounted the fact that I was nevertheless making some sort of progress and that I was still staying on point, even though I was, my road, if I had outlined it, was incredibly zigzaggy.
Yeah.
But I think I was sort of mistaken in the idea that there was a straight line to be had in the first place.
I mean, that's it. I feel like I've been very sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, really, the whole time. That your progress is going to be relatively slow if that's the case. If you're comparing yourself to people who confidently march forward, having had the benefit of, supportive parents and a good education and all those other factors. And then there are those of us who just find it much more of a challenge, really. And, that's often about whatever you're telling yourself in your head about who you are and what you are, unfortunately. So much of it is down to that. I mean, we could talk forever about it, but I definitely feel like I got into photography relatively late. I was 30. So my whole of my 20s, really, I kind of sleptwalked through that in a state of kind of, I don't even know, a kind of inertia, really, and a kind of low-level unhappiness, and also quite a lot of depression, which I'd had really since I was a kid. But I had a lovely girlfriend throughout that whole period, so life kind of seemed, on the face of it, reasonably okay. And obviously you can get away with not having any money when you're young, which, starts to become a bit less rock and roll by the time you get to a certain point. But, yeah, photography came along. Although I'd had an interest in it as a kid, it didn't resurface in my life until I was, like I say, at the tail end of my 30s. And yeah, I guess I did manage to kind of make progress, as I say, albeit in a very kind of dysfunctional and, like you say, zigzaggy way.
And you were spending most of that time in your 20s writing rather than photography, right?
Initially, yeah. That's how I got into photography from writing. I always wanted to be a writer from even when I was a kid. So it was almost like when I was at school, I was the kid who knew what they wanted to do at a ridiculously early age, which, I guess is quite notable because not many kids really have got a strong idea at that point. And so I guess, all my teachers thought, oh, well, there you go. Then Ben's going to go and be a newspaper guy. That was always what I wanted to do. And then I kind of just imploded, really. No one was really, because everyone thought, because I was like relatively a smart kid, and perfectly capable, I think people thought, right, he's okay. We don't need to worry about him over there. Let's focus on the people who need a bit more attention. And kind of, actually, I wasn't okay at all, really, kind of emotionally and psychologically. So, yeah, it all kind of fell apart, really. It took me a while to get back on an even keel. I mean, I sort of had to retake a lot of exams, which I failed the first time. And, I ultimately got myself back to college to do a degree as a kind of way of saving myself, really. I mean, that's it. It's just basically, Baron X, it's one story of managing to save myself from oblivion after another, really. And that pattern may well continue for the foreseeable future. I don't know.
Well, I completely get that. And I think for me personally, for whatever reason, early in my childhood, I kind of learned that I had to fend for myself, that there was no one I could really turn to ask for help, even my parents. But I think part of it all was also that I felt that if I opened up and I said that I didn't know how to do something or if I needed help, that opened me up to being vulnerable and hurt, by my peers or something like that, And so I think for the most part, for the great majority of my life, I always saw myself as the kind of person that, like, you can't ask for help. You just have to figure it out yourself. And I'm wondering how your experience reflects that mentality, if at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know. I think I probably would have asked for help if I had known who to ask. I didn't have anyone to ask, really. it might not have occurred to me. I'm not sure I even realized I needed help. It's that whole thing of, your experience at that age is just what is normal to you. If I'd been aware of just how much I needed help, I might have, sought out some kind of mentor, some kind of person who could take me under their wing. What I kind of wish is that I'd come to the realization, as I think you just said that you did, that these people around you, these adults, they're no use to you. They're not gonna help here. They cannot be of any practical help in terms of what you need. But you don't know how to say that when you're 16 years old or something.
Yeah.
So I just, a bit like you, I think I just kind of created a kind of armor plating, or what I would have hoped was an armor plating, against all the kind of trials and tribulations that I was having at that time. But, I think there may have been one or two people who could have provided that role. But like I say, it didn't occur to me to ask anyone. Certainly all of my teachers were next to useless. And my parents, bless them, also were not, really up to that particular job for me personally. And I mean, I've got siblings who may well have a very different story, but I think, we're all different and we're all in need of different things when we're that age, especially. And I think that's one of the problems. It's not a one size fits all thing.
Yeah. And I think that part of it for me was just this idea that I saw other people being able to do things so easily that I had difficulty doing. It was only until recently that I realized why that was. When I got diagnosed with major depressive disorder and ADHD, it's like, oh, that's why. And, had I had that understanding back then, I don't think I would have struggled as much, and I would not have been as harsh on myself as I was for the bulk of my life, because I couldn't understand why I couldn't do what seemed to be the simplest things that everyone else was able to do. And so that sort of that harsh voice in my head was really probably the biggest boogeyman in my life, that was always expecting me to be a certain way when, because of my chemistry, just I wasn't capable of being. And only in understanding what was going on and accepting that that's just the way I am, and not having a bad judgment about it, have I been free to be able to enjoy who I am and how I am.
Yeah. And, I don't even know at that point, was ADHD a kind of available condition, as it were? Had they even really started diagnosing it? It's extraordinary that you could, and I know this is probably more common an experience than we might think, but for you to have got so far through your life before you got diagnosed with that, is pretty amazing. And the idea that you might have got diagnosed so long ago that, it would have had a really serious, as you say, impact on how you then, viewed yourself. Because this tendency that we have to just blame ourselves for everything, you look around, you think all of the kind of available adults, they must know more than you do because they're adults and you're just a kid. So if there's some problem, it must be your fault. It must be something you're not doing right. And it's brutal, because we are brutal to ourselves in those circumstances sometimes, rather than having some compassion for ourselves. I don't know. I hope it's less common in this day and age for young people to have to sort of have those feelings, really.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about your story is how, in your career as a photographer and a writer, that you lamented that you didn't really leverage some opportunities that were presented to you, and that you just didn't take. You got a ball, but you didn't run with it. And I know that was something that you shared that you have some regrets over. What was really interesting, though, was when you shared those two audio notes that you made about what you wanted the podcast to be, and I heard that. A sort of, you were very, very determined to see it through, that regardless of what it might look like in terms of quote unquote success, that you were just going to see it through, that you weren't going to allow anything, even your own self-doubts, to keep you from pushing through and making this thing happen. And that was really fascinating to hear, because that was completely the same experience that I had, though I wasn't as conscious of it at the very beginning. But it certainly came up during the early years of the show, where I was just like, I can't give up doing this. I didn't know why. I just knew that I just couldn't give it up. And I'm just curious as to why at that particular moment in time you were so focused on seeing this thing through and not just dropping the ball and moving on to something else.
I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. And I think the answer is that at that point I had finally resolved to learn my lesson, I think. And I felt like my last kind of chance. I think they call it a Hail Mary pass, don't they, in the States? Yeah. Which I only learned the kind of origins of that saying quite recently, because obviously it's as your listeners on that side of the pond will know, it's an American football thing. But I had finally kind of understood a few fundamental lessons about how to be in the world. And, one of them was about just carrying on, really, and not letting that voice in my head, which is very self-critical, stop me from doing what I knew in my heart of hearts I should at least give a good go at. And so it's almost like it gets boring after a while, repeating the same mistakes over and over again and not learning your lesson. I mean, there's a bit of a fetish, I think, for failure at the moment, or talking about failure, because, as we all know, it's kind of a necessity quite often. But that's not to say it's somehow a good thing. You've got to take it as something that you need to get past, because if you just continue endlessly to make the same mistakes over and over again, you're not going to make any progress. So I think that determination that you heard was just a result of me going, look, you're 50 years old or whatever, and there really isn't that much time left to keep repeating these same patterns, I suppose is the word, patterns of behavior and patterns of self-doubt and patterns of making the same fundamental mistakes over and over again. So it was a kind of determination to test the thesis in a way that I had kind of come to understand was almost certainly true, which is that the only real difference between those people who manage to become successful in one way or another, or just do something successfully, and those who don't, is that little bit of commitment to see it through.
And when did you feel during the life of your show that you had done that?
I mean, I said to myself, I kind of gave myself an out, even despite what I've just said. I didn't want to put so much pressure on myself that in itself would be self-defeating. So I said, I'm going to do 50 episodes, and that is an absolute commitment. I will do 50. But if I get to 50 and I've just hated it and it's just, sucks, and I'm not enjoying it in the way that I hoped I would, or basically if everything about it is just not what I wanted, then I have permission to quit. But I had to do 50 episodes. So I think long before I got to 50, I realized that wasn't going to happen, and that it was something that was bringing a lot of positivity to my life and something that I was enjoying doing. And I think that feeling probably kicked in after a very small number, maybe 10 or 15 episodes. And I realized there was something to it, and that people had already started, albeit in very small numbers, to discover it, and to express their appreciation of it. And I think, when you get a little bit of positive feedback, it goes a hell of a long way. When you're someone who is used to being incredibly self-critical, if you get that little bit of encouragement from people, then that will really carry you through. And that's continues to be the case in a way.
Did you feel at some point that, I'm really good at this?
Oh, God, no. Let's not get carried away, Baronix.
Seriously? Oh, my God.
No, I mean...
Sir, you're good at what you do. I mean, in our small little genre that we have, you're my favorite interviewer. In terms of people who interview photographers, you are because you do everything that I've learned to do well, which is do the research, listen, and show a genuine enthusiasm. I think those are the bottom three. And I think you have all three of those. And it's one of the reasons I immediately loved your show when I discovered it. And I started, sharing it with other people, because there are a lot of people who, do interviews and may have a good voice, blah, 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 a good audio engineer. But, if you don't have those three things, it's really hard to hold my attention for, a very long period of time and not get frustrated, because, God, nothing frustrates me more than a bad interview. But no, I think you are really, really, really good.
Thank you so much. I mean, I can't tell you how much that means to me hearing it from you, because, in a way, you were my inspiration for doing it. That's a simple fact. I don't, not to turn this into some kind of mutual kind of appreciation society, but seriously though, I mean, I to this day still, when I listen to the way that you do an interview and the questions that you ask and the insight that you bring to those questions, I just go, I do that whole, Ben, you're just not ever going to get close to this guy, and I'm not just saying that. I'm really not. Like when Joel, when Joel Mayovitz is saying, constantly telling you, how incredibly awesome that question was, and I'm like, yeah, well, it was, and he's right, but also it's a bit like, ugh. So thank you for saying that. People do tell me that they think I'm good at it, and I do, obviously have huge support from my listeners and a great deal of positive feedback. But then I guess, old habits die hard, don't they? And there I am with my old kind of slightly self-flagellatory kind of reluctance to accept praise or accept, good things being said. I just do my best. And as you say, those three things are absolutely really the only thing you need. Mm-hmm. I am genuinely fascinated by other people and by hearing their stories. I do think it's profoundly important to prepare thoroughly, because I think that's in some ways just a matter of, respect for your guest, in a way, that you've done that and that you're ready to go. And what was the third one?
Just being able to listen.
Yeah, exactly. Just there you go. Yeah, and listening. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I really enjoyed your conversations, like with Martin Parr. I thought that was a really fun conversation, and it didn't feel, formal at all. And it seems like you guys were just bantering between each other, but it was so insightful at the same time. And I have to admit my enviousness at you having interviewed him before I did.
Well, thank you so much. It's funny you should sort of highlight that one of all of them, because I mean, a couple of things to say about that one. First of all, that is the most listened to episode of all, which is perhaps not surprising, because he's, probably the most high profile person in terms of his kind of, how well known he is in the wider world. But I thought quite carefully about that one, because I was having this whole conversation with myself about how I was going to approach it, in the lead up to it. And, oh man, this is Martin Parr, and, he's been interviewed a million times. And in the end, I just said to myself, you know what, Ben, just do what you usually do. Don't treat him any differently. Just because he's a bit more famous than, the next guy. It's just another photographer. So that in a way is what I did. And then I ended up thinking, but maybe that wasn't enough, because, you do want to at least try and come up with some questions they haven't had before. I'd love to hear you interview him, actually, I must admit. But it was fun, and he's a very playful bloke, Martin. He's not at all sort of standoffish or kind of unapproachable. He can, I guess he would seem that way before you've met him, but he's a lot of fun. And we had that whole bit where he teased me relentlessly for not having he gave me a little quiz on his photo books, which I failed dismally, because there's a lot I don't know. I mean, I'm not the thing about it is that I do the podcast as a kind of, student of photography rather than some kind of, self-professed expert. So, he had fun just torturing me with questions that I couldn't answer. But that was just a little added extra which we were able to put in. But thank you for saying that.
No, no. And I think one of the things that I've learned about the show that I think has had an impact on my photography, and I'm curious to hear if the same is for you, is that I learned that the more myself that I am, the better I am as in terms of a podcaster, rather than sort of modeling myself and thinking that I have to sort of, be something that I'm not. And as I've sort of applied that to my photography, I have found that my appreciation for what I'm doing has gotten better, because I think that we both set a unreasonable high bar for the quality of all of our work that I think would probably intimidate anybody. But that, when we get to the point where, I'm just being myself, that high bar and that unreasonable expectation sort of goes by the wayside. And I have a greater appreciation for what I'm doing, even if it isn't to the standard that I would like it to be. And I'm wondering, when it comes to your photography, whether you feel anything along those lines.
It's such an important insight, and I think that's the big learning. And, this is why I think that what we do here with this podcasting business is so valuable really to younger photographers and people who want to learn, because you are getting the benefit of people's hard-won wisdom here, and you're getting it the easy way, and you're getting it for free. Let's not forget, but we'll pass over that fact for now. But what you're saying is fundamentally critical, and I think we spend the beginning of our careers trying to figure out how to be us, and inevitably you might initially mimic the people who you admire, and you might try to be them for a while. And then the first crucial learning is to realize that you can only be you. You have to be you. And it's better if you being you is not really quite up to scratch. That is way better than you trying to be someone else, and maybe making a pretty good job of that. So it is absolutely, I agree with you. And ultimately, that's the only way forward, isn't it? You have to do you. I did have that insight from doing the podcast, and I have carried that over. So that's the other reason, for doing it. You can make these learnings and then apply them elsewhere.
And, when you were talking about on your show about a project you had been working on. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
I certainly can, yes. Well, it's ongoing and has been for a while. So the project is a long-term personal project, basically about a particular borough in London. So it's a kind of portrait of the borough. It's a place called Tower Hamlets, and it's a very typical borough in lots of ways. People who know London will be aware of it, but in other ways, it's a bit of an outlier because, first of all, it's a very poor borough, so it's one of the most financially deprived parts of the country, and it always has been. And then, right in the middle of it, sits this kind of anomaly of a place, which is called Canary Wharf. And Canary Wharf is essentially the sort of second financial district of London after the city of London itself, which is sometimes called the Square Mile. But Canary Wharf was sort of created from scratch in a way back in the 80s on a big chunk of what was then pretty much sort of derelict waste ground where the docks used to be by the River Thames, and had obviously that whole part of the world had fallen into disrepair. So they created this place, which is essentially an office and shopping complex, and it struck me as a really interesting metaphor for the oldest story in the book, really, which is the sort of the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. In all modern cities, really, you have that. Strangely, I mean, it was a kind of, for a long time, I had a title in search of a project, really, because I had this idea of A Tale of Two Cities, which is obviously a Dickens novel, but I thought of it in terms of living in a big city. Everyone comes across these amazing dichotomies, really. And, for me, I thought maybe I go to the poorest borough in London, I go to the wealthiest borough in London, I'll shoot in both, and I will make a project, which compares and contrasts. At some point, it became apparent to me that I didn't even need to do that, and that same discrepancy could be found in the same borough, and that particular borough here in London happens to be Tower Hamlets. So that's the project, really. It's about exploring some of those things, but it's also about, just showing the cultural diversity of the place. It's a very kind of dynamic part of town. There's hugely different populations all sort of forced together. There's a big Bangladeshi community. There's old school Cockney Londoners. There's the odd pocket of young hipsters. So, there's a lot of stuff to kind of explore. But basically, I'm still doing it, and I'm always finding reasons to procrastinate over continuing with it because, there's lots of things that I'm like unsure about in terms of how to get it finished, really, and that's the goal. So, I think I'd like to have an exhibition somewhere in the borough, which would be the most obvious thing for me. But ultimately, of course, there's also the possibility of getting a book made. So, I hope next time I talk to you, I'll have something a little bit more kind of concrete to say about it actually coming to fruition.
Since you interview so many of the people in person, have you taken advantage of that and shared the work with any of them?
Oh, God, yeah, I have. I mean, this is the fantastic thing about it is that 4.5 years ago, I had a very small group of really good, close photographer friends, some of whom are, exceptionally good at what they do. But fundamentally, I didn't really have much of a network, a peer network. And now I just know a lot of people and consider them to be friends in many cases. And so I do have access to a huge number of differing opinions. The downside of that is that everyone's got an opinion, as you know.
Yeah.
And although a great deal of value can be derived from hearing them, if you hear too many of them, ultimately it just becomes a sort of cacophony of differing views, really. And I'm not sure that it necessarily gets you anywhere. It's good to have your own ideas, obviously. And if you are the one who's making the work, then ultimately, it has to be about what you decide. But I have spoken to a number of people, and I've got all sorts of things which I need to sort of make notes about and collate. But I've asked a number of people, and in fact, I took the book dummy to a place called Chico Hot Springs in Montana, where my podcast sponsor, the Charcoal Book Club, they run a portfolio review. Now, this was exactly a year ago. I will be going again next month. But there because I wanted to put myself very much in the same position as the people who were there to have their work reviewed, I decided that, it would be good as a kind of podcast narrative to get some feedback on the book dummy. So in a way, it was a kind of win-win, because on the one hand, I wanted to, like I say, explore that as a way to give an idea of what it feels like to put yourself in that vulnerable position and have people sort of essentially assess your work. But at the same time, I got some interesting and useful opinions from people who I respect. So, that was the kind of plan there. I think for both of those reasons, it worked out quite well. But whether I'll actually remember what half those people said, or whether I'll take any of it on board or not, it remains to be seen. Obviously, when you have a project like that, you want it to be good, if possible. That's really the bottom line. I mean, you want it to be excellent if possible, but I'd settle for good. Yeah. That's the aim. So onwards and upwards, and hopefully I'll end up with something that I'm at least pleased enough with that I can say, that's good. I'll start doing something else now.
Well, I look forward to seeing that, because I like when I look at your images on your website. I really like your eye. I really like the way you see things. Whether it's
Thank you so much.
on the read or the stuff that you're doing with your son.
Mm.
Yeah, I really love how you frame things and how you use color. So it'll be interesting to see how you apply that to a particular project. Because I think that it's only through people working on a singular project for a short or a long period of time that you really get a sense of who they are as a photographer and as an artist, and even as a person. Because if you're just in pursuit of the singular image all the time, there's no really good way of crystallizing a voice. So it's good to see that you're moving forward beyond simply making the photographs.
Yeah, and it's interesting you should say that, because one of the observations that has been made about this project is that there's not enough of me in it, in a way, and that it feels like I'm a bit removed from it, in a sense that I'm somehow, too objective. And I find that a very interesting observation. And I think there's probably quite a lot to be said about that. So in a way, I think now I've got to sort of see what I've done and then have a think and figure out a way to, add some images that have a bit more of me in them, if you see what I mean. I mean, I don't even know myself quite what that means, but I've kind of got a vague idea.
I completely get it, because considering the kind of mindset we've always had about ourselves, it's no surprise that we're reluctant to put ourselves in our photographs. But it's the very thing that makes it, that creates that level of intimacy. Some of the personal projects that I'm working on right now are really more reflective of me, my life history, than anything else I've done. And the response that I've gotten to it has been stronger than anything else that I've done. So I'm, even with this third project that I'm just starting, that's probably the most personal thing I'll ever have done to date. But I think it's partly because I've gotten more comfortable in my own skin that I'm willing to go there. I think anytime before, let's say the last 5 or 6 years, I would have always had that sort of distant, objective point of view in all the work, just because I didn't feel comfortable with putting any of myself in there. But it's the very thing that I admire about some of the people whose work I do love, is that their willingness to be able to do that. It's not just about that they're able to make amazing photographs, but that they're able to leverage who they are as a person in their work, which is not an easy thing to do.
No, absolutely. Actually, I'm so glad that you've said that, because I was pondering about the question I know that's going to be coming, and we can sort of get to it when we get to it. But I was thinking about what photographer to recommend, and it would be so appropriate now, having heard you say what you just said, for me to go with the person I was going to go with. So I won't spoil the surprise, Ibernex. We shall continue for now, and then I'll
let's go. It's around that time anyway.
Okay. All right. So it's like, I know I'm allowed to have someone, who's I've liked for a long time. So, but the person that comes to mind when we talk about this stuff is Anders Petersen, who I spoke to for the podcast quite recently. And, I've obviously been aware of his work for many years, and I knew that, I liked it a lot. But when I really started looking at it carefully in preparation for the chat I had with him, I realized just how much it's the kind of photography that I love, because it's really all about that stuff that you were just talking about. He puts himself into it, and it's really all about emotion, and it's about this kind of visceral impact that I look for, really. And I want a picture to make me cry or make me laugh or sort of inspire a very kind of basic emotional response. And I think photography is subject to fashion like everything else, isn't it? And I think there seems to be, in recent years, a fashion for a much more kind of forensic, slightly kind of disengaged, dispassionate kind of approach for a lot of people anyway. And of course, there's room for everything. That's the beautiful thing about photography. It's such a broad church, isn't it? But the thing that really turns me on is the opposite to that, is stuff that just makes me feel emotionally very engaged with it. And so Anders Petersen, for me, always achieves that. And it's all him, really. As he said, this idea of the pictures having this longing in them, or this idea of longing, either that of the photographer or of the subject. And you can see that in his work, and I certainly do. So there you go. I'm going to go with Anders.
Well, thank you for that, man. And thank you for making time for me. Really enjoyed speaking with you again. So it was great fun.
It's an absolute honor. And I thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And thank you for what you've been doing for all these years, man, because like I say, you genuinely did directly have a really major influence on my decision to do A Small Voice. So, maybe without the Candid frame, there'd be no Small Voice, And I hope we've got a lot of listeners in common. I suspect we have.
I think we do. If not, we will be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks to Ben for joining us. Find out more about him and his podcast by visiting bensmithphoto.com. If you're a devoted listener and subscribe to the show, write us a review on whatever service you listen to podcasts. Those reviews have led people to take a chance on our show and allowed us to grow. Along with my recent book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow, I just released my latest ebook, 9 Pictures, 9 Stories, Volume 2. The first one got a wonderful response, and I'm back with a follow-up, where I discuss the stories behind 9 images that I created last year. It's only $8, and your purchase is another way you can support the show. Purchase that and any of my previously published ebooks by visiting the website. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and our mailing list. On the YouTube channel, I offer critiques on images submitted by TCF listeners like you, while the mailing list keeps you updated with all TCF events, including workshops and more. Sign up today. And remember, you can support the show by contributing to our Patreon effort or donating through PayPal. Thanks to Jeffrey Nisler, Creative Chaos, Randy Lee, and Robert B. Klontz for their recent contributions. It means so much to me. And if you found that you can't find every episode of the show, download the Candid Frame app, which is available for both Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.